Okay. Fantastic. Good. All right. Thanks, Sam. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all surviving lockdown Mark 2. Development opportunities in the new normal. Well, it's an interesting phrase, the new normal. I don't know how long the new normal will last, I suppose, if we get into a situation where a vaccine gets distributed next year. But I suppose that's the question. How much of what we're going through at the moment is permanent? How much of it is temporary? So there have been a lot of changes in planning and PD recently, and it's kind of really engaged me and our practice to quite some degree. We've probably been busier than we've ever been in the 10 years since I've been running my own practice, and probably almost as busy as I can remember in the 20 or so years since I started off in planning and property. Just by way of a little bit of background, I've been involved in planning and property for just over 20 years. I operate and I'm regulated by the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. I'm a Chartered Surveyor by general practice route, by qualification. So that means I have a background in valuation and in agency as well. Used to do office agency and then went into planning. I also qualified as a barrister and a solicitor, and I practiced as a solicitor in private practice and as a barrister and solicitor for local authorities for them as a planning lawyer. So a bit of a varied background. Our family has also been involved in property investment down through the years as well, and I also have a directorship with a property development company as well. So we've got our own things running in the background. So quite a mix of experience, which in a way is very, very helpful in trying to make sense of the PD rights and the practical implementations around them as well. So we've got a series of new PD rights that have been introduced, were introduced this summer, some in relation to the redevelopment, knockdown and rebuild of offices and purpose-built flats, others in relation to extending existing buildings, what other people have referred to as air rights, whether or not it's on buildings which are in mixed use or solely in residential use, or they're purpose-built blocks of flats, detached or terraced buildings as well. We've seen come into law changes to existing PD rights as well as through new PD rights, further requirements in relation to some of the factors you have to look at for PD. So not just transport and highways, flood risk contamination, for instance, but also the need for adequate natural light. That's been introduced to almost every existing PD or prior approval right there is out there. And because that's a requirement, there is also a requirement to provide plans and elevations as well. Elevations weren't previously required in some prior approvals, but they are now. There's also been changes to the use classes order, which some developers have found on the whole rather confusing, and new use classes in E, F, and some changes to sui generis. So I'll try and make sense of all of that as we go through and explain the overlap between that and the existing prior approval process and try and bust a few myths along the way. I think probably the best place to start is the time for implementation of planning permission, which is both a challenge and also an opportunity depending upon where you sit in a deal. One thing that I won't be covering tonight is information around the new white paper, largely because we just don't have time. There is a lot of that to go through, but it is something that I cover in as much detail as we can at the moment through my planning masterclass, but I'll give some further information on that as well. So one of the things that's often been overlooked is what happens with planning permissions and prior approvals at the moment. And it's worth bearing in mind because, of course, let's take a step back. Planning permissions and prior approvals, they both last for 3 years. But in order to save a planning permission, it takes a lot less time and a lot less cost. You more or less only have to dig a spade in the ground once you've discharged some pre-commencement conditions. Obviously, where you dig that trench has to relate to where you've got consent for foundations, etc. It can't just be a hole in the ground willy-nilly in the middle of a field. It has to have some bearing on what the consent actually shows. So not very much has to be done there, but with a prior approval for change of use, in order to save that prior approval, you have to actually complete the change of use, which by law doesn't take place until you have prepared the building, if the consent relates to a building or part of a building, if it relates only to part of a building, to the point that it's ready for usable occupation. It doesn't have to be occupied, but it has to be ready for usable occupation. So basically ready for your tenants or other occupiers to move in. So white goods all connected, probably fully furnished as well. The government has assisted to some degree here because it's brought in new law earlier this year. An outline planning permission, full planning permission list of building consent is automatically extended to the 1st of May 2021. There are slightly different dates that apply here, so it's an automatic extension to the 1st of May. If either of any of those permissions were due to expire between the 19th of August and the end of this year, if they were due to expire between the date of lockdown, 23rd of March, and the 19th of August, then you can extend it to the 1st of May, but you have to jump through an additional hoop called the additional environmental approval. You need to seek actual professional consultancy advice on that. It's not as complicated as the title would suggest, but there is a process for doing so. It's essentially a little bit of extra form filling and box ticking. Now, extending a planning permission is usually not a problem anyway if it's recently been obtained or there's been no change in the policies. So you would have to resubmit the plans all over again, and then, all being well, no changes in the policies in the meantime since it was last granted, then there's no reason to suspect it wouldn't be granted again, and then you've bought yourself another 3 years. It's the same with prior approval. You can just merely submit a prior approval again, buy yourself another 3 years. Obviously, that's not going to be easy to do if there's an Article 4 direction that's now closed off that prior approval right since the prior approval was last granted. And if that's the case, then you'll just have to try and complete as much of the development as possible and crack on with development on site. So for those who have planning permissions or prior approvals on sites that they're looking to sell or exit from, you'll need to look very carefully at what's left in terms of years for implementation, and therefore you'll need to be looking carefully at that in order to safeguard value in your sites. If it's a role reversal and you're negotiating with vendors and they are selling with the benefit of a planning permission or prior approval and they haven't started work yet, then obviously there may be an opportunity to negotiate with them on the price if they are on the cusp or right up against the wire in terms of implementation and saving those permissions. So this is the first of effectively about 6 or 7 new PD rights that were introduced in the summer, and they pretty much follow a pattern all the way through. So we will deal with detached blocks of flats first. So not single dwelling houses. These relate to blocks of flats, and either they're purpose built as flats or they'll be mixed use. So this one is a starting point. This is where we are looking at buildings which are purpose built as flats, so that they didn't become flats by way of prior approval or change of use or an application for planning permission. And it's only as flats. So there are no HMOs in there. They're all flats. They're all C3 use. The buildings have to be completed as flats between those 2 dates shown. So 1948 was the birth of the modern day UK planning system. And in March 2018 was the date on which the right was announced to the House of Commons as due to come in. The building has to have been completed as flats, but doesn't mean to say that it's disqualified if there have subsequently been extensions to the building, or there have been changes to the building in any other way. If there have been built extensions to the building, then that may disqualify it from this right. So you need to think very carefully about, am I looking at a building which has been extended since it was first completed, and particularly if it's been extended at roof level already. The rules here, in a sense, I'm summarizing each of these. You have to go through them in some detail when you're looking at each opportunity here. So we're focusing really on the main conditions and the main requirements. This right only applies where you're looking at a building which has 3 stories as a minimum. So our building on the right-hand side in this picture has 3 stories. We see a full ground, full first and full second. Not quite sure from that picture if it's got a flat roof or it's got a pitched roof, but let's imagine it had a pitched roof and it had accommodation in the loft. That accommodation, that level is not a story in terms of the new PD rights. So if we had an image on the right-hand side which was ground first and then had a pitched roof with accommodation in the loft, that wouldn't qualify under this PD right because it wouldn't have 3 stories. They have to be full stories and not include accommodation in the loft space. That doesn't mean to say that you can't take off the pitched roof, put in 2 stories, and then put the pitched roof back on and perhaps even put accommodation in the loft, in the roof space. But the important point to remember is it doesn't count as a story when looking at whether or not it meets that minimum requirement. Now you can go up to 30 meters, that's including the 2 new stories maximum, under this PD right. So that's roughly about 9 stories in total. It does not apply to listed buildings. It doesn't apply in conservation areas or areas of outstanding natural beauty. It does apply, however, in Greenbelt, because Greenbelt doesn't fall into that classification in the rules, which relates to particular areas which are excluded. Quite obviously, won't apply within certain distance of an aerodrome. And the important point here is there are a number of requirements here which are part of what's called prior approval. So it's prior approval because you have to seek the council's approval before you do the work. So if you've already started works on extending at roof level, it doesn't matter so much if you've started works elsewhere in the building, say as to convert it. That's not the problem. The problem comes when you are then extending at roof level. You started works to commence an extension at roof level, then it's too late. You have to seek this consent before it gets to that point. Then you have a number of boxes to tick, a number of things to check off. The council will look at whether or not there would be overlooking to surrounding neighbours, loss of privacy to them, whether or not the new units would be overlooked either. Would there be any loss of daylight and sunlight to neighbours? Would there be adequate daylight and sunlight to the units themselves? And probably most difficult to put your finger on is what would be the impact on the external appearance and the architectural appearance of the building. Now, the rules don't necessarily expressly limit external appearance as a test, as a requirement in this case, to just the appearance of the building. So because it's fairly loosely phrased in the rules, the council could quite conceivably apply it quite widely and say, we're also going to look at external appearance and impact on the street scene. So that gets very difficult when you're looking at an area where there's fairly consistent roof level, roof heights and scale and massing and building form as well, to try and start extending at roof level and pushing stories up and buildings upwards where there isn't that difference in height, there isn't that variety in appearance, then I'd expect that would encounter some pushback by local authorities, and they might very well reject on that basis. It is obviously something that can be also tested against transport and highways. The council will have a look at that. and you need to probably look for sites where they're either very well served by public transport, or there are spare parking spaces on site. You do not want to be in a situation where you're trying to find spaces on site which you need for the new units, and you're trying to move existing car parking spaces around. You may not be able to do that under existing leases or certain other agreements with occupiers. Flood zone impact is also relevant here, and not because of the extra extensions at roof level, but because they may lead to the need for further works at ground level, such as extending refuse storage and cycle storage. And because external appearance is an issue, it may be something where you have to look at a flat roof block. May be easier to do so rather than taking off a pitched roof and just adding 2 stories on top of that, whether or not you then replace the pitch on top of the extra stories by that point in time. But that's very subjective, and again, very much depends upon the local context and external appearance. So we've looked at detached purpose-built blocks of flats. If the block is not purpose-built, perhaps it's been converted under planning permission or under prior approval, then there is no PD right for extra extensions. So what you then have to do is you then have to create a mixed-use building out of that. And what you then therefore need to do is you then might need to reintroduce a small commercial unit to any part of the block, usually perhaps at ground floor level, maybe a shop or a restaurant or something like that, in order to bring it within this PD right, which is for detached mixed-use buildings. Now, if the block is completely in any of the conforming commercial uses, we'll come on to what those are in a moment, and there's no residential, then that's fine, it can still fall within that. It's only the problem comes where the units, where the block itself has been converted under planning permission or prior approval, it's not purpose-built as flats, and there's no commercial uses in there at the moment. So you can win this right back by putting in commercial units, which weren't there previously. And they have to, the commercial units need to be either shops, A1 shop, restaurant, A2 professional use, betting shop, payday loan shop, laundrette, or B1 office. And if it doesn't fall within any of those uses, let's say, for instance, you've got commercial units in the building, which might be a dental surgery and a yoga and Pilates studio. Well, you'd have to change those uses to one of the conforming uses, which I just mentioned, before you could win this right back. Now, you could do so under the recent changes to the use classes order. So, for instance, with the 2 examples of the units I've just mentioned, yoga, Pilates studios and dental surgeries, they now both fall within the same use class as B1 offices, shops and restaurants. And they don't require an application for planning permission or any notification to the council to change to a B1 office or shop or restaurant. So you could use the freedoms of the new use classes order to do that. In pretty much all other respects, the detached mixed-use buildings are subject to the same requirements as what we have just seen with purpose-built blocks of flats, again up to 30 metres height limit. There is an additional requirement that noise impact on the new residential units has to also be tested for obvious reasons, because there are commercial uses in the building as well. And it's important also to remember with every single one of these new PD rights, as to distinguish them from prior approval for office to resi or retail to resi or the like, the existing prior approvals, that if the council gets to 56 days or 8 weeks and hasn't made a decision, you don't automatically get permitted development. It's just the same as an application for planning permission, and the timescale could roll on, so you don't automatically get the consent. So in simple terms, it could look something like that. So you could go up to 2 stories, each story assumed to be a maximum of 3.5 metres, so that's why the graphic on the left shows 7 metres, and a total maximum of up to 30 metres, so in theory up to about 9 stories. So instead of detached mixed-use buildings, we could be looking at a terrace mixed-use building instead. Very much the same as detached mixed-use buildings. The only real difference here is a slight difference on the height limit. It's not up to 30 meters now, or 9 stories, it's up to 18 meters, which is about 5 stories. Also, the extension can't be any more than 3.5 meters above the height of any of the other buildings in the rest of the terrace. So it might work something like this. Our building on the left-hand side is as existing. We then seek to extend it on either side. Maybe we don't have control of the bit in the middle, but we can only extend it by 1 floor up to 3.5 meters. We can't go any higher than that because we'd be more than 3.5 meters above the height of any other part of the terrace. I have to say here, though, that don't get too excited about this graphic. This only shows what's mathematically possible. Remember that one of the key issues you're going to have to face is external appearance. And quite frankly, anything on the right-hand side that is done that way is going to look odd in the street scene, particularly if the buildings around it are significantly lower as well and consistent with the prevailing roof height as shown on the left-hand side, and so could be turned down on grounds of external appearance by the council. So they have quite a lot of discretion and control over this. It would be slightly different if, for some odd reason, historically, you were looking at the image on the right as the existing front elevation. And therefore you are looking at PD to try and just push the bit in the middle back up in line with what's been done, and therefore level off the roof height and the roof ridge. And there would be a strong argument for doing so on grounds of external appearance then. So this is an example of how the lowest building in a terrace can have an impact upon the PD rights. So the building second from left, just to the right of the period building, is the lowest in the elevation, and therefore if you went to go up a story on any of the other buildings, they would be obviously more than 3.5 meters in their height after completion above the height of the building second from left. So that building is pretty much pulling down the potential under PD of the rest of the terrace. Not to say that it wouldn't be worth looking at under an application for planning permission, all other things being equal. Obviously external appearance still a factor, but clearly a difficulty under PD. If you were to be extending the building second from left, and that's the one that you're extending, obviously more scope there because the buildings either side are already higher. So instead of terraced mixed use buildings, we're now looking at terraced single dwelling houses. Again, it's the 18-meter height limit and subject to that 3.5 meter difference in height along the rest of the terrace. Because there's no mixed use here, there's no commercial uses, then there's no requirement to test noise impact. Again, that's what it would look like. Again, don't get excited. You see a semi-detached row of houses, don't think that you're going to be able to extend an isolated one or every single one in that area upwards, because external appearance will probably stand in the way. And instead of terraced single dwelling houses, we're now looking at detached single dwelling houses. So we see how each of these covers every conceivable opportunity there is out there. And this is the right that would use if you're only looking to extend in floor space, but not add units. So in a 2-story, you've got ground and first, and then you've got accommodation in the roof space. You could go another 2 stories up and then reinstitute the accommodation in the roof space. Or if it's single story, you can only go 1 story up and then of course reinstitute the accommodation in the roof space. Daylight and sunlight, of course, is one of the factors that I've mentioned has to be tested. There is a presumption that If you break the 25-degree line measured through the center of the lowest ground floor habitable window, then that would mean that there's a presumption that daylight and sunlight is not complied with. It doesn't necessarily end there. You could always engage the services of an expert daylight and sunlight consultant, who then has to look at it on a detailed basis using the Building Research Establishment guidelines for daylight and sunlight. It's something which is very niche. We go out to other firms to look at this. So the example at the bottom in terms of the proposed might still be acceptable, even though the 25-degree line is broken, but that would have to be individually assessed. The last PD right that was introduced recently relates to the redevelopment of B1 office, R&D or light industrial buildings or purpose-built blocks of flats where they predated 1990 and the old building does not exceed 1,000 square metres in gross external area footprint. Now, footprint is an arguable term, so conceivably if your building has an undercroft, the undercroft could possibly not be counted within the footprint. So let's say it's 1,100 square metres with the undercroft, but the undercroft is 200 square metres. So possibly that might be 900 square metres in footprint and not 1,100. So there is some leeway around this because there is, quite frankly, there's very little in the way of definitions in the current laws. And where there's very little in the way of definitions and there's some uncertainty, there is opportunity. This only applies to detached buildings, but it's going to be quite useful, particularly if you're looking at buildings of this nature, where they might otherwise be subject to, say, Article 4 directions, and there's an opportunity to knock them down and rebuild and go another 2 stories up on the old buildings. Obviously up to a total height of 18 metres, and you can't go any more than 2 stories up on any part of the building. So that means that if you've got a building that has a varied profile of partly, say, 3 stories, partly 2 stories, then you'd be looking at a building that's partly 5 stories and then partly 3 stories. So it basically has to follow the profile of the old building, although you can put in a new basement or cellar and a new plant where there wasn't one in the first place. There are I don't think there are any, I haven't come across any Article 4 directions that have been drafted in relation to any of these. Obviously they are PD rights, so they could be subject to Article 4 directions. But even if there are Article 4 directions that have been drafted or even made, you'd have to look at those at a local level in the case of each local authority that you're applying to, so you have to check their websites. And even if they've been made very recently, they would be pretty much hot off the press if they have been done so, then they don't usually take effect for some months. So there will be a window of opportunity regardless to get your applications in and get them consented before those Article 4 directions take effect. The reason why this is particularly useful for, as I say, those kinds of commercial buildings which might otherwise be subject to Article 4 directions is because if there was an Article 4, you might otherwise have to go for an application for full planning permission, which means that normally you have to prove through some consistent marketing over, say, 12 to 18 months, that there's no demand for it as employment premises before the council will accept the principle of a change of use. You don't have that in this case. You only have to show that the building's been vacant for at least 6 months prior to the application. So that certainly does help. Now we will see in due course that national space standards will come in as well and apply to all of these. There are a few other things to bear in mind, that any units, additional units built on top of or as part of these uses, they can only be for C3 use. So you cannot convert them to C4 use other than by applying to change the statutory condition, but you can't normally do so. So you have to assume that this is only going to be for self-contained dwellings. It's not going to be for creating larger self-contained dwellings and then moving them onto HMOs afterwards, because there's a statutory condition in place with all of these that they only can be for self-contained C3 dwelling units. The other thing that I would mention is that, of course, affordable housing requirements don't apply to any of these. So looking over many of these, you will see that for various different reasons, it will look and feel very much like an application for planning permission. It can last as long as an application for planning permission. The number of requirements and planning issues that need to be considered will be very similar to an application for planning permission. National space standards will apply in the same way. The planning fees will be applied in the same way. So the whole planning fees regime is going to change around that very shortly. In fact, it already has changed around that. And of course, one of the big factors that distinguishes this from the previous prior approvals rights like office to resi and retail to resi is the design and the external appearance is a factor. And that's a very, very big subjective issue, which makes it feel exactly like an application for planning permission and adds a degree of uncertainty there. So people who have often spoken on this area and done so in terms of a new gold rush or with some excitement about great new opportunities, I don't deny that there won't be opportunities, particularly in the very short term, if you can get your foot in the door before Article 4 directions take place. But don't get overexcited about how easily you'll be able to find these opportunities, because we've turned down looking at opportunities, just as many opportunities in the last few months as we've been presented with opportunities as well. It's well in the minority of those that we've given the green light to go ahead on, partly because they're just looking to, some people are looking to extend buildings which are not appropriate given the context in which those buildings are and their neighbouring heights, etc. So you've got to match the right PD to the right opportunity. Checking the age of the building can be a bit of a guess at times. And you could go to such websites as the Old Maps website. You just put into Google Old Maps, but it comes up with also with a website which I think is www.old-maps.co.uk. Clearly there are issues of structural integrity you'll need to think about. You can structurally reinforce the buildings within the PD rights as well. You'll have to apply for that within your application. But you have to structurally reinforce internally. So there will be practical issues there about access to existing flats and existing commercial premises if you need to do that. There may be an opportunity, however, there for lightweight modular construction. I've already dealt to some extent on design and external appearance and mentioned a team of experts you're going to need around you. And also there are issues around legal argument and also, for instance, we talk about the ultimate height of the building, either 18 metres or 30 metres. Where do you measure that from if it's sloping ground? Well, there's no clear definition on that at the moment, no clear guidance on that, so you'd probably measure it in the way that best suits your case. Parking rights, as I've mentioned, can be difficult, and that's why sometimes it's best to look at places which are close to public transport, so you don't need to find new car parking spaces. And of course, building regulations and fire safety is also paramount for obvious reasons. So most developers now are designing their schemes to the national space standards, which means that micro units might be very, very difficult. And there'll be issues around whether or not, A, you can get permission, depending upon when you're coming forward with these schemes, and also saleability afterwards. Now, consider the situation of a typical micro unit, maybe 35 to 40 square meters, 1 bedroom, 2 person. A 1 bedroom, 2 person under the national space standards would have to be at least 50 square meters. So that wouldn't comply. But of course, national space standards are not in at the moment. It was always intended to bring national space standards into prior approval and PD rights from the beginning of the year, because there had been an earlier commission report in January saying that there had been a few bad apples, or rotten apples, amongst developers who were building poor substandard accommodation under PD, and it recommended bringing in daylight and sunlight standards and national space standards to PD and prior approval. So we've already seen daylight and sunlight standards come in. Now, when they came in August, they came into force pretty much immediately at the beginning of August, but then there was a period of about 3 to 4 weeks, which are called the transitional provisions, which allowed a period of grace within which you could submit an application and not have to comply with the daylight and sunlight requirements under PD on prior approval. So it might very well be the same in this case with national space standards. But we've seen no change in the law yet. We've only seen an announcement on the ministry website, and I don't know when the government is intending to bring in that change. There has been a challenge against the government recently, which has been heard in the High Court in mid-October. It was brought in by a campaign pressure group, and they were arguing that these PD rights and the use classes order rights, which we'll come on to shortly, were brought in too hastily, and there wasn't proper consultation, and they would be bad for the UK economy and for standard of accommodation, etc. That's been considered by the High Court and might go on to the Supreme Court afterwards. We'll have to wait and see. But at the time that this was being heard in the High Court, that's when the government brought forward its press release to say, yes, we're finally going to bring in national space standards. But as I say, they haven't acted on that yet. They haven't brought it forward into law. So it was largely, its timing was largely, I think, more than coincidental. It was timely in relation to that High Court case, as well as a Labour vote on the PD rights in the House of Commons on the same day it was brought in. So as we're beginning to see that there's quite a flavour to the new PD rights, I think gone are the days of the silver bullet, and even with a new prior approval, the old prior approval rights office to Resi, some of these loopholes, some of these opportunities are beginning to close down. People are a lot more aware of how their sites might benefit from prior approval, and so their asking prices are higher as well. And so I think that there are going to be some opportunities with PD and prior approval, but in the majority of cases, you still need to know how the planning system works. You need to be savvy about how to prepare your scheme and how to negotiate with officers, and you are going to encounter and be hard up against planning issues and planning merits tests. There's no getting away from it. And so for that reason, from the summer, and we've run already 2 of these, and we'll be running another one later this month in November, is a planning masterclass. And dealing with these sorts of issues is a bit like climbing a mountain. It's all very well pointing out where the opportunities are, but you're only ever halfway when you get to the top of a mountain. So you're really only halfway, not even that probably, finding the opportunities. There's still a lot of work to be done to turn it into a solid opportunity and turn a profit and get the planning sorted as well. And so that's what we go through in this masterclass. We go through the new PD changes in some detail. We also show you some of the things that we've used with clients to work on these PD and prior approval changes, to look for them in areas where most people are not really looking. And so we'll give you also a bunch of requirements lists, which also take you into areas where you can find some really promising PD and prior approval opportunities in areas, again, where I say people won't be looking. And so because it's more targeted and it relies on our experience in 20 years of helping clients over planning, you'll waste a lot less time in looking. We spend a lot of time on things like managing cost and risk and the sorts of things and due diligence that you should be looking at before you buy sites, even before you even speak to any of your experts, and start incurring professional costs as well. So it helps you to obtain more approvals faster, more efficiently, and be more confident and competent in stepping up to larger schemes. And also because we're aware that the SME market does need an injection of reality from experts. It needs us to just tell you what's happening at the coalface and not try and sell you a dream which is probably a false dream, doesn't help you in the long run, but also to do so and help you to get started at a lower cost, a lower practical cost. So this will all be recorded and it will be run from the 24th and 25th of November. It's 2 afternoons from 2 p.m. till just before 6 p.m. And there's an opportunity for case studies and lots of information as well. And that's the total cost. And I'll come onto this again later on in the session. And Sam will send you a link as well. So changes to the use classes order was sort of part deux of the most recent reforms, the white paper notwithstanding. And what that has meant is where you are looking for applications or looking at applications for full planning permission or outline planning permission, we speak a different language in terms of use classes. So we no longer speak the language of use class A or B or D. We speak in terms of use classes E or F1 or F2. Now that only in relation to applications for full planning permission or outline planning permission submitted after the 1st of September 2020. There is no change to the use classes order in all other respects. So if the planning permission was submitted before that date, whether or not it's full or outline, or if it's prior approval, regardless when it was submitted, we still talk in terms of the old use classes order. So it's a parallel system running side by side. This has been brought in order to facilitate quicker changes to commercial premises, usually at ground floor level, where they're suffering already from structural decline of town centres and retail. But it has been amplified somewhat by the current pandemic. And so the government brought these changes in on a temporary basis to see how it goes up until the 31st of July next year. After the 31st of July, the current use classes order will automatically expire and it will go back to the use classes A, B, C, and D. There's been no change to the use class C in any event, no matter which system you're operating under. So all the residential use classes are completely untouched in that respect. And I'll say the community-based uses and the leisure and recreation-based uses like under D1 and D2, they've been split between F1 and F2. That means that if you've got a dental clinic, if it's a indoor recreational gym, or it's a nursery, then you can move freely from an office to a retail, to a restaurant, and back again, and you don't need an application for planning permission. You don't have to apply for anything. It may be a good idea to keep a record of what's being done, so there's no question that it was lawful at the time it was made. Pubs, cinemas, and theatres have been moved into separate sui generis category. That is effectively, it's a sort of a miscellaneous category. Sui generis basically means in a class of its own. And what it does is that every use that appears in sui generis is as if it's individually bubble wrapped. And so you need to apply for planning permission, whether or not you go from one sui generis use to another sui generis use or to any of the other uses, such as A, B, C, or D. As I say, there is a small lacuna there in relation to what would otherwise be a standard A shop, a use class A shop, if they are food shops, basically essential local food shops, and they are no larger than 280 square meters. If that is the case, and there isn't a similar shop within the kilometre, then it falls into class F2. It doesn't go into use class E. Now, it'd be quite useful actually, because in the site on the right-hand side, that was a church hall, and then we changed the use of that to a reflexology clinic, so that's a health clinic. And at the time we changed that, that was before the use class changes took effect. So we made that change in August. That was to increase the value of the site from one of a small community hall. And the following day, the community hall use fell away from D1 into F1. And the use which it was now in, which was a health clinic, previously didn't require an application for planning permission to change from the community hall because it was in the same use as the community hall. But on the following day, when the day this came into effect, it then fell into use class E. So it went in a completely different direction to the community hall in terms of its use, which is very useful because when it fell into use class E, it then fell into the same use class as uses such as offices and retail. So in theory, we could change the site to a Tesco's and therefore increase the asset value of the site considerably. We have since obtained planning permission for use class E and 9 flats on top. It's as a precursor to going for a larger development for 26 units, for which my client would have to pay affordable housing contribution. So any opportunity to increase the value of the site from its previous existing use value is welcome, because it means that we don't have to pay so much in terms of affordable housing contribution at the end. So 22nd of July is when these new use classes order changes came into effect. When they were, this was the date on which this slide, I think, was first done. Then the use classes order was brought in. I think it was introduced on the 22nd of July, 2020. And then it took effect on the 1st of September. So between those two dates, still no change to the use classes order. Nothing has changed in respect of any kind of application for planning permission or prior approval. From the 1st of September to the 31st of July, the only applications affected are those for full application of planning, for full planning permission or outline planning permission made after the 1st of September. If they were made before the 1st of September, there's no change. If it was a prior approval application, either made before the 31st, the 31st of August or afterwards, still no change. And the prior approval regime, such as offices to retail, offices to resi, retail to resi, that will continue on up until the 31st of July and beyond. So anybody who says, well, this means that the existing prior approvals have either come to an end or they're due to expire on 31st of July next year, that is wrong. The only thing that will expire, no other changes aside, and assuming no other changes to the law in the meantime, the only thing that's going to expire in the meantime is the use classes orders, the new use classes orders as they apply to new applications for planning permission. After the 31st of July, it reverts to the old use classes orders. Now, the thing is, if you make a change within, or you're within the same use classes order as another use, so in this case, offices are in the same use classes order as an A1 shop, then you can change from one to the other and it doesn't count as development. And if it doesn't count as development, then no Article 4 directions could be used to impede or stop that change of use. So you can imagine a lot of local authorities are not too happy about these use classes orders because it takes a lot of control out of their hands. And as we've seen on the previous slide, the example I've given, it can also mean that they inadvertently lose a lot of community uses out to other uses. So that kind of works against the way in which their local plan policies are set up. There might also be opportunities to circumvent Article 4 directions. So for instance, if you have a 3-story building, which is an office, might be subject to an Article 4 direction saying that you can't go under Class O prior approval rights to change to residential. then what you might try and do is change the ground floor to a shop under the use classes order, and then change the offices above the shop to offices that are ancillary to the new shop. And that way you can then use Class G rights to put in 2 new flats above the shop and not require application for planning permission. So you'd use a certificate of lawfulness application to use Class G rights for the upper floors. So that way you can get some residential accommodation change from the commercial use. I'm not aware that it's been tested so far, so expect that you might get some friction from the local authority if it's not widely been done before. Obviously, changing from one commercial use to another may open up the need to conform with other regimes, whether or not it's building control or might be licensing. So if the council feels that it's somewhat lacking in control in planning, it might try and make up for it in making life difficult for you in licensing, for instance, with restaurants as well. And the other points I think we've covered in terms of the re-emergence of out-of-town retail, where, for instance, if you've got office buildings and you want to change them to retail, given what's happened with retail generally, I don't know whether or not that's a valid concern, that there will be lots of out-of-town retail springing up. But certainly retail on the high street has been suffering, and there's obviously opportunities in the high street, whether or not they're for sort of short-term or medium-term gain. One has to choose wisely where you're going to pick a retail unit for conversion to residential. I would generally aim for more peripheral pitches or corner sites, partly because you can get better quality units which have a dual aspect. You can get better outlook and better daylight and sunlight, especially if you're just doing converting the rear to residential. If you're more towards the centre of a pitch as well, it might be more difficult because the council might be more focused on preserving the retail integrity towards the centre of pitches, not so bothered about more peripheral or corner sites. Again, converting any space above a shop which is ancillary to the shop, you can get up to 2 units. If it's a double frontage, then you could probably split the unit down the middle, and so therefore you've got 2 shops probably occupying 2 separate addresses, and then you can change the upper parts to 2 units on each side, and therefore a maximum of 4 units. That's obviously to be contrasted with space of shop as an office, which is not ancillary to it, and that would obviously be converted under Class O PD rights, not Class G. Now, if you want to ultimately move it on to income generating rather than for capital growth reasons, so you want to move on to an HMO use as use Class C4, you can go from C3 to C4 under Class L PD rights. But it's a bit like crossing a large highway. You have a wide highway. You have to stop on the island in the middle. You have to make sure that that C3 change of use is completed, and therefore it's ready for usable occupation before you then move on to apply for a certificate of lawfulness to then change on to use Class C4 for small HMO units afterwards. Although pubs to residential requires an application for planning permission, they are still worth looking at in some areas, and not least because pubs have been suffering in some areas for some time, but they are becoming more difficult to get planning permission for. The recent pandemic has brought home to many how much they miss their local pub, and some local pubs have been a strong local hub for the community. So you have to look at for evidence for community use, what sort of functions they operate. Do they have live music events? Do they have sports events, darts, pool leagues? Are there copies of the leagues posted up in the windows or near the bar? Have there been trophies gathered in one corner of the pub as well? What can the publican tell you about what sort of events they hold? Do they have a function room? So on and so forth as well. So you have to look at that, and then you have to look very closely at viability evidence around the existing use and make a case to say that the existing pub is not viable in its current form, and that the changes that you're promoting will bring about a more viable use and a sustainable long-term viable operation of the pub. Got to be careful, of course, where, for instance, you've got live mic or live music events taking place routinely in the pub area, and for those to continue, and those being a lifeblood of the pub itself, if you were then to bring forward a scheme which proposed residential units, separate residential units on the upper floors, the council might be concerned about that, because they would be concerned that the future occupants of those units might put pressure on the legitimate trade of the pub by complaining about the noise from those events. So that's called an agent of change, and that could be a ground for refusal. Now, there is mitigation that you can offer in terms of noise insulation, etc., but obviously you need to be aware that it's going to be more problematic with pubs that run those sorts of events. Some pubs have a heritage value to them as well. They're either locally or nationally listed, so there may be specific factors around what you can do physically with the building as well. With this pub, which was in Camden, in London Borough of Camden, we got a roof extension on there. We put a mansard roof on top, and you see the dark area around the edges of the building. That indicates on the ground where the extent of private physical occupation was. The rest of the pavement was publicly owned. So it's important, if you're going to extend down into the beer cellar and put in light wells, that you can understand what the limits of your physical occupation is. And that's essentially what we did. That's light wells, and there was grating, open grating nearest to the edge of the building, and then there was toughened glass sitting alongside that nearest to the pavement. So we had the bedrooms, and we had bathrooms and stores, utility rooms down in the basement, and then the ground floor was where the main living accommodation was, reception room and kitchen space. So where are the main issues and opportunities going forward? Well, difficult to say what's going to happen with the office market. There's such a lot of variability there. Different businesses and different offices have a different percentage of their cost base as offices, so it may not be the same for everyone, and density of occupation varies between central areas and more suburban areas. And in some locations, such as the City of London and financial institutions, you can expect that there's obvious reasons why there's going to be less of a desire to move away wholesale to working from home. There's a strong cultural change, there's a strong cultural factor around keeping a presence in high profile areas like that. And a lot of local authorities just not going to want to see large swathes of offices moved over to other uses. There's a large tertiary economy that relies upon office occupiers being in the cities. And, you know, you've got the Costas and the Pretts, you've got the shoe shops, you've got even hotels and restaurants and lounge spaces and meeting spaces as well. So I would say that that's, there might be the odd pocket of opportunity, but I wouldn't get too excited about it for a number of policy and obvious practical and economic reasons as well. Pubs we've already touched upon, and I would say also Greenbelt is also best to avoid. For now, there's no seeming change to the council, to the government's policy on Greenbelt on the horizon, largely for political reasons, I would have thought, and I would venture to suggest that there are a lot of conservative voting areas which benefit from Greenbelt designation. So it would probably turn over a lot of votes for them to lose those areas to from Greenbelt protection. They won't want to see that. But I certainly say in the short term, there's opportunities in town centres for PD and prior approval. And you might then want to build on that in terms of future capital growth, targeting areas which are going to also benefit in the long term from perhaps regeneration, sustainability, and renewed investment in the long term as well. So generally speaking, at a high level, there are those kinds of opportunities. So where does this fit within the grand scheme of things? Well, clearly when you're looking at opportunities, you have to start somewhere. And we often encourage our clients to start with the obvious market due diligence, the deal structure that has to go in there. And then sometimes we also look at the big, the main policy red flags around that as well. And we'll go on to in a moment how we work with clients on that basis. But also one of the things that we teach on the masterclass is we give you a clear checklist and criteria as to the things that you need to be checking before you engage and start speaking to any consultants. So it saves you a lot of time and it saves you a lot of costs as well. Because when you start getting into a detailed conversation with anybody who does what I do, or transport and highways consultants and the like, you're going to have to start spending fees. So this helps you to sort through and sift through the opportunities out there and better understand what you are targeting, why you're targeting is it, and where it works and what and how best to go about that. So that's often step one. And then when we develop the conversation more, that's when we build a strategy around it. We look at whether or not there's a PD or a prior approval opportunity, what the fallbacks are. Is your fallback, perhaps if there's no PD or prior approval opportunity, your fallback might simply be, if all things don't work out well on planning, you might be looking at having to do an investment hold on the existing use value. So knowing these things from the outset helps to understand the risks and also helps to manage your relationships in the deal with co-investors, the bank, equity, shareholders, stakeholders, etc. You have to then understand how you're going to go about exploring those opportunities, how much to spend on the planning process and with what consultants and at what stage. So there's an element of risk money there. And then we go into looking at how long it all takes. And of course, that's really key because the longer it takes, then the longer there may be holding costs as well, which you also have to factor into your appraisals as well. Then we also, we look at opportunities around timing and whether or not certain parts of the process can overlap with others, or we have to do some certain things in a sequenced stage in order to make the best case possible before you move on to step 3, which might be either a pre-app or it might be initial prior approvals or PD applications, then going on to a pre-app, then going on to full application. And then we deal with all that strategy as well. And when we discuss this with clients, we often look at a first very, very high level light touch review. We look at the principle of development. It's not focusing on the numbers at all. It's basically, is it worth a punt in terms of what they're proposing? So is there a heritage bar on it? Is it very much against the principle of conversion for some reason? And is it one of those where basically we'd probably all be wasting our time looking at it much further? Obviously, we'll give the client the option whether or not they want to take the risk and go forward in any event. But we'll look at it at that level. What are the possible PD or prior approval opportunities? Once we get an idea of that, if the client then wants to take it further forward, that's when we look at a detailed initial planning review. We start delving into the numbers. We don't need a pre-application in every case. You don't necessarily need one with PD or if it's been tested before, but there is an element of building relationship and playing a game with officers. So sometimes we have to look at a pre-application. And then of course you go on to full applications or outline applications and it becomes a little bit more involved as well. and in some cases where we're relatively confident of the prospects, either because we've got a strong fallback or we've tested this previously through pre-application or a very similar planning application that's already gone through, then we might do it on a risk sharing basis. So that's usually a low base fee with a high success fee. But that is normally on larger schemes. So typically we've agreed base fees of around £2,000 to £3,000, and then the success fee element is usually £10,000 plus. But if there's Section 106 agreements that have to be negotiated and or further revisions or committee appearances, then there may be further fees as well. So you've got to pretty much know and understand the rules of the game and how it works. It's not just about looking for opportunities. It's also about going through the process, because the wheels can very, very easily come off at any stage along that process. Part of the skill to what we do is the case management side of it. It's not just about find the opportunity, work out a great scheme, put the application in, and hey presto, within 8 weeks you've got your consent. It just doesn't work like that. The whole planning process is somewhat of a negotiation, and you have to work with officers to a degree and listen to what they're saying and pick up on the signals so you can understand how far you can push the opportunity and then bag a consent. So I suppose the other way of putting this is, if it were easy, everybody would be doing it. As I say, I think what we're seeing, what we have seen steadily over the last few years, is those opportunities for easy 20 to 30% profits on GDV, on just doing a simple prior approval flip or a PD flip. They're very, very few and far between. Most of the time, if not almost all the time, you're going to have to engage with a planning process. There's just no getting away from it anymore. We've seen that with the new PDs as well. They feel like a full planning application in almost all but name, and therefore you really need to know this. So if you're serious about being a property developer and serious about not even just doing even large schemes, but even smaller to moderately sized schemes, unless you're just going to do you know, the homes under the hammer, not through the kitchen wall and a bit of refurb and tarting up. If you're seriously into property development and doing a genuine property development scheme, changing of use, new extensions, etc., then you need to know this stuff and you need to understand it, not just so that you can manage the process and avoid the pitfalls, but also you can have an idea as to where the opportunities are, which other people are not seeing or they won't exploit. And so you can squeeze a lot more profit and gain and revenue out of it than others are not finding. And that's what we do on the masterclass. We take you through it in 2 days. It's basically 2 afternoons from roughly about 2 till 6. Again, on the 24th to the 25th of November, we look at real projects and examples, and managing cost and risk around the process is absolutely key on it. A lot on due diligence. We work very closely in some cases, some very rare opportunities, rare cases where we've got JV situations. So we've seen it on the developer side of the fence. We've seen it on the investor side of the fence. I've not just obviously been a planning consultant, I've been a lawyer, I've been involved in agency and valuation, and I've also seen it through our own family, who's also been property investors as well. And no doubt, as you have to respect that if I'm doing things on a risk sharing basis, I'm putting a certain degree of sweat equity into schemes as well. So I understand how it works. And we take you through the process and how to best use pre-apps. Sometimes you need them, sometimes you don't. And how to negotiate on applications and various strategies around planning costs, minimizing affordable housing contributions. It's very, very, very thorough. But we're not there to teach you. I'm not there to teach you how to be a planning consultant or an architect or any other professional. I'm there to teach you. This is a masterclass for developers and investors. It's to help you lead better through the process so that you can be a more effective leader and therefore know how to take a development through from start to finish. It gives you a lot more credibility as well. So again, those are the dates. That's the cost. I think Sam will be putting in a link into the chat box as well. And those are my contact details. Thank you for listening.